The street had always been so quiet that even the wind seemed to pass through it with caution. But on that October evening in 1985, silence felt different, dense, swollen, as if the air itself were holding its breath. Porch lights flickered on one by one, their glow trembling against the mist that rolled in from the maple woods behind the houses. In that dim hush, a mother's scream cut through everything. Eleanor Hart's voice shattered the routine of Oak Lantern Road. Her 8-year-old son, Daniel, was gone. Only minutes earlier, he had been playing on the gravel path near the old birch tree, a landmark every child in the neighborhood used as a boundary. But now there was nothing, no footprints, no bicycle overturned, no sign of a struggle. Just the birch tree standing alone, white bark glowing faintly under the street lamp. People emerged from their homes, hesitant at first, as though afraid the darkness might swallow them too. Doors creaked, and silhouettes clustered on porches. They were neighbors who knew each other for years, who shared barbecues in the summer, watched the 4th of July fireworks together, and waved politely during morning routines. Yet now, not one of them dared to look directly into another's eyes. At the far end of the street, he stepped outside. The man who almost no one spoke to. The one whose yard grass grew too tall, whose curtains were always drawn, and whose mailbox always looked too empty or too full, never in between. His name was Leonard Graves. Middle-aged, thin, and awkwardly stooped, he lived in a weathered blue house that seemed permanently half asleep. He had arrived in the neighborhood 12 years earlier and never quite belonged, not for lack of trying, but because no one ever forgot the uneasy feeling he gave off. A feeling that he carried memories too heavy for one person. Leonard stood on his porch now, holding a mug of tea he never actually drank. He had heard Eleanor's scream, but hadn't moved for several seconds. His face looked pale, but not with shock. Something else. Something older. Deputy Collins was the first officer to arrive. His cruiser's headlights swept across the street, catching glimpses of the anxious crowd forming outside the Hart home. Eleanor stood at the doorway, trembling, repeating Daniel's name as if it might pull him back from whatever void he had slipped into. Neighbors offered words of sympathy, though each of them felt the same creeping unease. Daniel had vanished in a place where nothing ever happened. Collins organized a quick sweep of the area. Flashlights combed through the grass, bushes, and shallow ditches. Volunteers walked in tight lines along the tree line, calling for the boy. Dogs barked from distant houses. The wind rustled dry leaves, making them sound like tiny footsteps escaping into the night. Leonard walked toward the crowd slowly, almost reluctantly. People stiffened the moment they noticed him. No one said anything, but tension spread like a ripple. Collins gave him a curt nod. "You see the boy today?" the deputy asked. Leonard swallowed hard. "Not since yesterday. He waved to me when he rode his bike. That's all." His voice trembled slightly. Not enough for suspicion, but enough for discomfort. Collins studied him a second too long. "Let us know if you remember anything." Leonard nodded and slipped away, disappearing back into his dimly lit yard. But as he turned, someone noticed something. His clothes. His boots were muddy, as if he had been walking deep in the woods. Yet he'd told the mailman earlier that morning he hadn't gone anywhere all day. The detail lingered in the mind of Mrs. Calder, the observant widow who lived across from him. She stared at Leonard's retreating figure with tightening eyes. She didn't say a word, not yet, but she felt a stirring in her chest, a whisper of intuition she'd long learned not to ignore. Inside his house, Leonard closed the door softly, leaning against it as though holding back a tide. The silence of the room pressed on him, suffocating. A faint smell of damp earth clung to his coat. His hands shook as he removed it. He glanced toward the back window, toward the woods, toward something only he seemed to notice lurking in their shadows. Outside, the search continued. Voices grew sharper. Flashlights carved frantic slices of light across the landscape. But the boy was nowhere. And the longer the night stretched, the more Oak Lantern Road began to sense that Daniel Hart had not simply wandered off, that something had been waiting for this moment. Something that one man, standing alone in his darkened house, might have understood far earlier than anyone else. Something he feared would return before dawn. The morning after Daniel's disappearance arrived without sunlight. Thick clouds hovered low over Oak Lantern Road, pressing the sky downward as if the entire town were shrinking under the weight of something unspoken. The search party had worked through the night, but dawn brought no answers, only swollen eyes, cold hands, and a lingering dread that clung to every porch and window. Leonard Graves watched the street from behind a slit in his curtains. He hadn't slept. His mind kept circling back to the woods behind his house. Dense maples, old roots twisting through the soil like veins, the faint smell of wet leaves that always reminded him of things he tried to forget. In the gray light of morning, memories returned without permission. His father's voice, sharp, commanding, echoing through their childhood home in rural Maine. His mother's silence, frail, brittle, carrying its own kind of cruelty. The long nights when little Leonard hid beneath the attic stairs while arguments thundered through the house. He had run from that world as soon as he could, settling in Vermont hoping for quiet, anonymity, a place where people didn't ask too many questions. Yet questions had a way of finding him. He stepped back from the window as he heard a knock on his door. 3 firm raps, not neighborly, authority. Deputy Collins stood outside, accompanied by Sheriff Dalton, a man built like a tree stump with deep-set eyes that missed very little. "Morning, Leonard," Dalton said, his voice unusually gentle, the way officers sometimes spoke when they weren't sure if they were addressing a witness or a suspect. Leonard forced a nod. "Any news?" Dalton exhaled slowly. "Not yet, but we're expanding the search. We'll need statements from everyone again." Collins glanced down at Leonard's boots resting by the door. Clean now, scrubbed too thoroughly for a man who supposedly hadn't slept. "Mind if we ask where you were last night between 6 and 8? Collins asked. Leonard's throat tightened. He had known this was coming. He tried to steady his voice. "At home. Alone. Anyone who can confirm that?" "No." Silence swelled. Dalton's eyes flicked toward the woods behind the house. "We're sending volunteers into the deeper section this morning," the sheriff said. "Let us know if you've ever seen anything unusual out there. Animals, strangers, trespassers." Leonard hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but enough. Dalton noticed. "I'll let you know," Leonard murmured. When the officers left, Leonard locked the door and sank into the nearest chair. His heart hammered as memories overlapped with the present, making the world blur. Because he had seen something in the woods. Not yesterday, not last week. Years ago. Something he had tried so hard to dismiss that he'd almost convinced himself it wasn't real. Shadows moving where they shouldn't. Footprints too small and too deep. A child's laughter echoing when no one was there. He didn't know what it meant, but he feared it. Across the street, Mrs. Calder stood at her front window, watching Leonard with a fixed intensity. Unlike others, she did not fear him. She studied him, observed patterns, traces. She remembered the mud on his clothes last night. She remembered seeing him standing near the birch tree earlier that day, moments before Daniel vanished, even though he'd told the officers he hadn't been near it. She pulled a small notebook from her drawer, the one she kept for observations no one else cared about, and she began writing. Neighbors gathered in clusters outside, whispering theories, each quieter than the last, as though they might summon danger just by speaking too loud. Strangers passing through, coyotes, some drifter living in the woods. But each time someone glanced at the blue house at the end of the street, the conversation faltered. Late that afternoon, search dogs picked up a faint scent heading north, toward the old logging trail. Volunteers hurried after it, their shouts fading into the trees. People held their breath. Leonard remained on his porch, gripping the railing until his knuckles whitened. He stared at the forest line, where the trees stood like patient sentinels, and in that stillness, he felt it again. A pull, a memory, a truth he had tried to bury so deeply that even he no longer knew where it ended and fear began. As the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the woods in bruised shades of purple and gold, Leonard caught sight of something between the trees, just for an instant. A small figure, unmoving, watching him. When he blinked, it was gone, but he knew the moment had been real enough to shiver his bones. By the third day, Oak Lantern Road no longer resembled a neighborhood. Patrol cars lined the curbs. Volunteers drifted in and out with hollow eyes and mud-caked boots. Reporters hovered near the main intersection, hungry for tragedy they could shape into headlines. What had once been a quiet pocket of Vermont now pulsed with suspicion. Thick, contagious, impossible to escape. Leonard Graves felt it with every step he took. He walked to his mailbox that morning not because he expected a letter, but because he needed the gesture, something routine, something normal. Yet even this small attempt collapsed under the weight of the neighbors' stares. People paused mid-conversation when he passed. They lowered their voices. They watched him as if waiting for him to slip, to reveal something he wasn't even sure he knew. He turned back toward his house, fingers trembling around the uncollected envelopes. The air felt colder than it should have. The woods behind the houses loomed darker, their branches curling like fingers ready to grasp. What unnerved him most wasn't the others. It was the feeling that the woods themselves were watching. Inside his kitchen, he set the mail on the counter and noticed a single scrap of paper shoved halfway under his door. Thin, soft, folded once. No handwriting on the outside. He opened it with a slow breath. "I saw you by the birch tree. You need to tell them what happened." His blood iced. No signature. No hint of who left it. But the handwriting, thin, careful, deliberate, instantly reminded him of someone. Mrs. Calder. He sank onto a chair, pressing the heel of his hand to his forehead. Memories rose again, tearing through the years. The birch tree, the child's laughter, the flashes of movement in the woods. Things he had convinced himself were tricks of the mind, hallucinations, trauma echoing through time. But now they threaded themselves into the present, refusing to stay buried. Outside, the search had shifted deeper into the northern ridge. The logging trail, once an abandoned path, had become a chaotic grid of footprints and flags marking areas already checked. Sheriff Dalton walked at the front, his jaw clenched tight beneath a week's worth of stubble. "This doesn't feel like a wandering case anymore," he muttered to Collins as they scanned the forest floor. "Something's off." Collins nodded. "The dogs keep losing the scent, like someone's wiping it clean." Dalton glanced back toward the cluster of houses barely visible through the trees. Or like the boy was carried. It was not a conclusion he was ready to voice to the town. Meanwhile, Mrs. Calder decided she'd waited long enough. She crossed the street in her heavy wool coat, moving with a certainty that belied her age. When Leonard opened the door, his face drained of color. "I know you saw something," she said softly, stepping past him without waiting for an invitation. Her tone was calm, almost maternal, but her eyes were sharp, unyielding. "And I know you're too frightened to admit it." Leonard backed away from her as though her presence pulled at something inside him. "You don't understand." "Oh, I understand quite well," she replied. "I've lived on this street longer than anyone. I've watched you hide behind those curtains for years. Something changed in you the moment that boy disappeared." He swallowed hard. I didn't do anything. That's not what I said." Silence filled the room, heavy as snowfall. She moved toward the rear window, the one facing the forest. "You've been afraid of those woods since the day you moved here. I've seen you staring into them at night." Her voice softened. "Leonard, what do you think is out there?" His breath caught, as if she had cut a thread he'd been desperately trying to hold together. Images flickered behind his eyes, tiny hands brushing against bark, muffled cries woven into the wind, the outline of someone standing where no one should be. "I don't know," he whispered, though the trembling in his voice betrayed him. "Yes," she said quietly. "You do." A sudden knock on the door startled them both. Sharp, urgent. Leonard flinched. Mrs. Calder shot him a knowing look, as if confirming every suspicion she already nurtured. He opened the door to find Sheriff Dalton standing there, his expression grim. "We found something," Dalton said. The words were steady, but Leonard noticed the sheriff's hand tightening on the door frame, as though bracing for what came next. "It's north of the trail," Dalton continued. "You need to come with us." Leonard's heartbeat stumbled, then quickened. Not because he feared what they found, but because deep down a part of him already knew exactly where they were headed. And why? The northern ridge had always been the quietest part of the valley, an old stretch of woodland where light rarely touched the ground. The trees grew close together, their trunks darkened by decades of moisture, their roots forming uneven ridges beneath the moss. Few locals wandered that far anymore. The air carried a kind of stillness that felt older than the town itself. Sheriff Dalton led Leonard and two deputies into that silence. Their boots sank into the damp earth, leaving narrow impressions the forest seemed eager to swallow. Leonard followed reluctantly, every step heavier than the last. Mrs. Calder watched from her porch as they drove away, her expression unreadable, her notebook pressed to her chest as though it were a shield. The forest grew darker as they advanced, even though it was still early afternoon. Dalton stopped near a cluster of fallen logs marked off by orange tape. Deputies moved slowly around the perimeter, their movements tense, deliberate. Leonard felt the cold seep into his bones before Dalton even spoke. "We found something we can't explain," the sheriff said quietly. His calm voice did nothing to ease the dread hollowing out Leonard's stomach. "You should see it." Leonard wanted to refuse. He wanted to turn back and run until the trees behind him became nothing but memory. But Dalton's stare pinned him to the moment, forcing him forward. They descended a small slope into a hollow where the ground dipped unexpectedly. The wind barely touched the place. It felt insulated, trapped. A deputy pointed to a depression in the earth. At first, Leonard thought it was an animal burrow. But no animal burrow had wooden planks arranged inside. The faint remains of a structure, small, crude, hidden. Perhaps once a shelter, perhaps once something else. Dalton crouched beside it. "We don't know how old it is. Could be years. Could be decades." Leonard's breath hitched, because he recognized it. Not consciously, not as a memory with edges and dates, but as something he had felt before, deep within the dark corners of his mind. A shape from childhood nightmares. One of the things he thought he had imagined. His father had built something similar behind their old home in Maine, not for shelter, for punishment, for silence. Dalton noticed the shift in Leonard's face. "You know what this is?" Leonard shook his head quickly. Too quickly. No, I didn't." Collins cut in. "Animals dug up part of it last night. We found fabric caught under one of the boards. Doesn't match anything Daniel was wearing, but..." The words hung unfinished, heavy. Dalton stood and walked closer to Leonard, lowering his voice. "Look, no one's accusing you of anything. But you live nearest to this end of the woods. If you've seen anyone out here, teenagers, trespassers, hunters, we need to know. Anything could matter." Leonard stared at the hollow. The leaves scattered inside, the rotting wood, the dirt that smelled like rain and memory. There were things he could say, but none of them would make sense. Because the truth wasn't in words, it was in flashes. A boy's voice in the distance, his father dragging him across rough ground, the slam of a lid above him, the darkness pressing against his face, the way the soil shifted when someone walked overhead. He hadn't thought about those moments in years. And yet now, standing at the edge of the hollow, it felt as if time were folding in on itself, past and present merging into something he couldn't control. Dalton spoke again, softer this time. "Leonard, if you know anything, this is the moment to tell us." For a long time, Leonard said nothing. Words gathered at his throat but fractured before they could form. Shame, fear, and confusion tangled inside him. His silence felt heavier than any confession he could give. Finally, he met Dalton's eyes. "I've seen someone out here," he whispered. "A figure. I don't know who, just someone watching." Dalton stiffened. "How long has this been happening?" "Years," Leonard admitted. The sheriff's jaw tightened, a flicker of anger and disbelief passing across his face. "Why the hell didn't you report that?" "I thought it was my mind," Leonard said, voice trembling. "I thought I was imagining things." Dalton exchanged a grim look with Collins. Before anyone could respond, a deputy shouted from farther up the ridge. "Sheriff, you need to see this!" Dalton ran toward the voice. Leonard hesitated at first, but something inside him, an instinct he did not trust, pulled him forward. They reached a narrow clearing. The deputy pointed at a patch of disturbed soil near a fallen pine. There, Partially exposed beneath the roots lay a small object. A shoe, a child's shoe, light blue, untied laces. Leonard felt the world tilt, colors draining until only the forest's cold breath remained. He knew that shoe. He had seen Daniel wearing it 3 days ago. The wind shifted, carrying a faint scent of earth freshly turned, rich, damp, unmistakably recent. Leonard's knees almost buckled, because something about the placement of the shoe felt deliberate, not discarded, not lost, left, as if someone wanted it to be found. And as Leonard stared at the disturbed soil, he realized the ground looked wrong. Not dug once, but dug twice, as if someone had buried something, then returned later to take it back. Leonard stood frozen before the disturbed patch of earth, his breath shallow and uneven as though the ground itself were exhaling beneath him. The deputies marked the perimeter, their movements suddenly sharper, more deliberate. Sheriff Dalton placed a heavy hand on Leonard's shoulder, not accusatory, not comforting, but grounding, as if steadying a man drifting too close to some unseen edge. "Don't touch anything," Dalton instructed the team, though no one had dared to move. The shoe lay where the soil had revealed it, its bright blue fabric dulled by mud, a fragile, heartbreaking reminder of the life that had vanished 3 days earlier. Dalton crouched slowly, his eyes narrowing at the pattern of the disturbed dirt. "It's been dug recently," he murmured, "but not by an animal. Someone was here." Leonard felt the words settle heavily in his chest. He swallowed hard, tasting the metallic tang of fear rising from old wounds he had never healed. He stepped closer, compelled by something he could not name, as though the forest itself had tightened its grip on him. Dalton rose to his full height. "Leonard, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer carefully." Leonard's voice was a whisper. "I don't know anything. You might," Dalton said, "and you might not realize it yet." The sheriff gestured toward the hollow where the shoe had surfaced. "Someone brought the boy here. Someone knew this forest well enough to hide something and come back again." Leonard stared at the woods surrounding them. The branches shook with a breeze that didn't reach the clearing. Every shadow felt too deep, every rustle too intentional. A memory flickered again. His father's boots on the ground above him, the sound of earth shifting, the sudden weight of silence in the dark. That same silence pressed against him now, smothering, familiar. "Sheriff," a deputy called from a few yards away. "There's more over here." Dalton moved toward the voice, but Leonard remained where he was, unable to pull himself away from the sight of the shoe. He knelt slowly, almost reverently, and the cold seeped into his bones. The earth felt alive, breathing, calling. He touched nothing, yet the soil seemed to pulse beneath his gaze, as though holding secrets it wasn't finished revealing. Dalton returned, his expression set, jaw tight. "We found drag marks leading deeper into the ridge. Not old, not washed away by the rain. Someone moved something large recently." Leonard's stomach nodded. "Something," Dalton repeated, locking eyes with him. "Or someone." Leonard felt the accusation, not in Dalton's voice but in the forest's quiet. It pressed in on him, a thickening fog of suggestion. Perhaps it had been waiting for him to break. Perhaps the years of silence had been leading to this moment. His thoughts spiraled, disjointed. What if he had sleepwalked? What if the past had seeped into the present? What if he had done something and buried it so deeply that even his own memory refused to show him? Dalton watched the panic flicker through Leonard's expression. "You need to tell me everything you've seen in these woods." Leonard shook his head helplessly. "I don't know what's real anymore." "Yes, you do," Dalton snapped, the patience thinning in his tone. "You've been afraid of this place for years." "People don't fear empty trees, Leonard. They fear what they've buried inside them." A sudden shout cut through the clearing. "Sheriff, over here, we found—" The voice cracked into silence. Dalton spun and ran toward the call. Leonard followed instinctively, branches whipping against his arms as he stumbled through the underbrush. The deputies clustered around a small ravine where the land dipped sharply, the ground dark and soft. Something lay at the bottom, not a body, but a small collapsed structure of rotted planks. A second one. identical to the hollow they had found earlier. Leonard's breath hitched, a deep tremor running through him. Dalton turned to him sharply. "You've seen this before." Leonard pressed a shaking hand to his temple, his voice cracking. "I didn't build that. I swear I didn't build that." "So who did?" Dalton demanded. "Who knew these woods like this?" Leonard's gaze drifted slowly toward the far tree line, toward a distant, unmoving silhouette half hidden by the thickening fog. Too small for an adult, too still for an animal. A child-sized figure, watching him, waiting. Leonard's lips parted in a silent gasp, but when he blinked, the figure vanished, swallowed by the mist. Dalton followed his stare. "What did you see?" Leonard stepped backward, breath trembling. "Sheriff, I think someone else is out here." Dalton narrowed his eyes. "Who?" Leonard looked toward the fog again, his voice shaking with a truth he didn't dare finish. "I think it's someone who never left these woods." And somewhere behind them, faint and fragile, something shifted beneath the earth, as though the forest had just awakened. If this story pulled you into the shadows of Oak Lantern Road, don't forget to leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, share this video, and hit the like button. Your support keeps these hidden stories alive.